I'll be reading a selection from Book 1 of The Way of Thorn and Thunder, Kynship, Kynship, and this is from Cycle 2, The Eternity Tree. This is a story of the first days, and the beginning of the kin. This is a teaching. In a birthing storm that made the three worlds tremble, the seven branches emerged from their deep green mother, Jaya, the true tree. Oak, pine, willow, thorn, cedar, apple, and ash. Born of leafy-haired Jaya and her green-skinned lover Drohodu, grandfather of the mosses, the first kin danced to life in their new world, and they gave joy to their mother and father, and to their world. Their roots drank deeply from the endless eld green, and they flowered in the sunshine and bounty of the unending heavens. The kin grew strong and flourished, and each family branch brought different gifts to all the people. Those kin of Oak Branch were the chieftains of the deep forests, the voices of leadership and reason, orators and philosophers of old. Those of Pine Branch called the high mountains home. They were teachers, wisdom bearers, the mystics of the people, and in their dreams sought the future and the knowledge of the past. Willow Branch was dedicated to the way of the wanderers, and Willow kin traveled the rivers and great waters, becoming diplomats and traders, friends of other folk in lands far away. Within rocky hills and brush-hidden caves lived the Thorn kin, and they were honored for their war teachings and courage. They were weapon makers, the strength finders, the warriors who rose against all enemies and led the people to victory. Cedar Branch was the line of the artists, singers, storytellers, and history keepers of the kin. They wove the teachings into their songs and baskets, and it was in their paints and clay statues that the old ways endured. Among the apple kin were the earth bearers, the planters and ground watchers, those who brought great bounty forth from dark soil. They understood and honored the ways of the plant people, who in return gave sustenance to all the folk. It was left to the ash kin to bring comfort to the people when death and pain brought down the green tree. They were the healers, the spirit tenders, and guides to the ghostlands, where the people would endure in another form and return again, as the lightning-struck tree falls to earth and becomes new seedlings with the care of fresh rain and warm sunshine. When all was in balance, the branches grew strong and wise, and the people flourished. But there came a time when some of the restless ones, those who watched the stars and turned from the green world, lingered too long in the heavens and forgot about their deep roots. Their hold on the old earth began to wither and die, and they drifted, seeing nothing but the sky, even as they hungered, their mouths filling with cinders. They forgot the ancient language that all creation shared. They forgot that the trees have long-reaching voices, that the clouds sing to heron and goshawk alike, that the river whispers to the swimming otter, the minnow, and the little water beetle. The balance unraveled, the soil weakened and crumbled away, and even those who held to the soil found themselves falling, washed away by the rain, scattered sunward by the blistering wind. Some of the people dug deeply in the earth and turned away from the sky, thinking to return to the balance, but they forgot the sunshine. Their leaves became dust, and their roots starved. Those treading firmly on the celestial path called themselves shields, for they saw themselves as guardians of a new way of being in the world, and they scorned the flesh and its joys and pains. Those holding fast to the way of deep green were the green-walking wielders, and they drew on the lifeblood language of the eld green, the weir, and ignored the gathering storm that even then threatened to uproot them without mercy. So it came to be that the shields fell upon the wielders, seeking to purge the people of the trees in their blood and the moss in their skin. And though many wielders survived, Many died, their blood running like floodwaters through the lower world, and the people suffered. This is a teaching. It is a reminder and a remembrance. And then I'll read a little bit from earlier in the book that the previous passage gives some context for. The night passed slowly. Warm now, they sat by the red embers and stared off into the darkness. Tarsa hesitated to speak. She didn't know how to say what she was thinking, but the silence was too oppressive. She couldn't go back to Red Cedar Town, not after revealing herself as a wielder. Her family had already demonstrated that their fear of her overwhelmed any sense of kinship. And although she was no longer alone, one question in her mind was a wall that separated her from this strange old she-kin. Tarsa generally felt comfortable around Unahi. It was a surprise for her, especially considering Unahi's curt manner. She rarely felt at ease among others, and those who'd once shared comfort with her were far away now, back in Red Cedar Town. Her few friends and lovers had once ignored her strangeness and loved her in spite of it, but that was before the stone skin came to the valley. Everything changed then. She could still see their fear-maddened faces as they joined her family in driving her into the burning mouth. For a moment her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. Those memories belonged to another life. It was Namsheke's life, not hers. Namsheke was gone. Through blood, death, and fire she'd become Tarsa Desahe. And she'd now have to build a different understanding of herself. Unahi was the only one who could help her with that task. But one thing still kept her from embracing the old wielder's presence and guidance. She took a deep breath. Did you kill my mother? Her aunt's mouth dropped open in shock. Why would you ask such a thing? Evita told me once, when I was very young. She said that you were jealous of my mother, so you made her sick and then refused to heal her. Tarsa's eyes shimmered, but her full lips were drawn in a tight line of defiance. She looks just like Landalar, Unahi thought sadly. Not all elders are wise, Tarsa, remember that. A mean spirit sometimes just gets stronger with age, not smarter. The wielder chose her words with care. No. I never harmed your mother, except maybe in a youngling game of tag the tree, but then she usually hit me back twice as hard. Tarsa smiled nervously, and Unahi continued. I loved Landalar. We all did. She was the youngest, a little sprout in a grove of tall saplings. No one thought our mother would be able to have any more younglings. She'd suffered greatly when Evita was born, and 2 seedlings were lost before your mother joined us, but though we all adored her, I was her favorite, and she was mine. Unahi stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, rummaging around in her pack for a small cloth bag that she brought back to the fire with her. Her 3 fingers drew a handful of leaves and twigs from the bag and tossed them into the fire. The air grew rich with the earthy scent of juniper that cleared the mind and the eyes. She returned to her seat and looked back at her niece. The pox was a sudden one. I'd heard of it, of course. In those days you usually heard about these sicknesses from traders and refugees, before death suddenly appeared in the town, usually in a sucking youngling or a weak old burl who couldn't leave his pallet. and this one was no different in that way. It struck the old and young without mercy. It ran like fire through dry leaves, burning all that it touched to ashes. Her voice grew hoarse. I was one of the first of Red Cedar Town who fell to the fever. All my understanding of the weir was useless. This pestilence came from outside the Everland, like so many of our woes. I thought I would die alone. That's usually what happened when the blistering sickness hit a town. All who could leave did so as quickly as they could, and they generally scattered, sometimes carrying the plague with them to other towns. So I lingered in a fever for I don't know how many days. And when I emerged, I saw your mother. She'd stayed with me through the worst of it, bathing my wounds, kept me from scarring too terribly. Unahi drew a mottled hand across her gray eyes. She stayed with me until I'd recovered, but by then she'd already started to suffer herself. So I stayed by her side and cared for her as best I could in my weakened state, but it wasn't enough. Tarsa hugged her knees to her chest as she listened. The lightning had ceased, but the rain was heavy again. Occasionally the eyes of small beast people glinted in the darkness beyond, their curiosity aroused by the two figures who sat on either side of the crackling fire. The old wielder cleared her throat. When everyone returned, the shield blamed me for their deaths. What defense did I have? No one was there to see what had happened. Landelar gave you into Geth's keeping before coming back to look for me, and in the end it was just the two of us in Red Cedar Town. I was the only survivor. I should have been dead too, but instead it was Landelar who was gone. Our sisters went mad with grief. Your mother's last words were for you, Tarsa, and I begged the others to let me share them with you, but they believed the shield and drove me away. Even Geth refused to listen. Most had turned away from the deep green when two of our brothers, green walkers to the heart and red thorns themselves like you, fell to an ambush by a human raiding party. My sisters believed the shield when he said that the old ways were useless, that the only peace our brothers would have had was in the arms of Luran. And they believed him when he said that I had brought Landelar to her death through jealousy and witchery. So I was beaten and sent from the only home I'd ever known. And I'd never returned until 2 nights ago, when I saw you for the first time since you were a swaddled sprout. Unahi smiled softly at the younger she-kin, but it did nothing to mask the sorrow in her eyes. Tarsa rocked in place for a while, listening to the rain fall off the rock shelf above them, and to the steam of the nuts roasting in the coals of the fire, watching as sparks popped up and flew on smoke into the night. A nightbird cried mournfully in the distance. His shrill voice railed against the rain that would leave him drenched and hungry this night. Geth did believe you, Tarsa said at length, still staring off into the darkness. She told me that it wasn't your fault. She told me a lot of things, but there was a lot she didn't know. We stood at the arch with the others, but we weren't celestial, not in our hearts. She never wanted to leave the deep green. She turned to her aunt. Will you teach me? Unahi nodded. Tarsa remained silent for a moment more, then said, My mother, you said her last words were for me? Yes, the wielder nodded, draping her still damp shawl on the rocks beside the fire. What did she say? Unahi's eyes were warm. Tell her to tend to her roots.